Greetings, everyone. Jill Robinson, CEO of TRG Arts here. I am so pleased to be here for our deeper dive on generative AI and its application, its practical application to arts and culture and our creative sector. And boy, what a hot topic this has been in recent weeks and months. Even last night on the news, I was hearing this massive narrative about the impact of AI on our society and the world. And yet today in this session, what I want to ensure we focus on is the real practical and excellent application of these tools and this technology to you and your work in this sector that has been so affected by the past 3 years, the pandemic, and the staffing stresses and other things that have resulted. This technology can and should be having a daily effect on your results, your speed to work, your creativity, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. I'm pleased to be joined by two experts in this on this subject and in this field. They are teaching business and nonprofit sectors outside of arts and culture. TRG, their focus is definitely on this technology and more. So I want to introduce them to get us started. First, greetings to Amith Nagarajan, who's chairman of Blue Cypress. It's a family of purpose-driven companies that TRG became a part of in 2021. Amith, thanks so much for joining us today. Would you just tell our group here a little bit about your interest in and experience with this tech?
Sure, I'd be happy to, Jill. Thanks for inviting me. Really excited to share some insights with everyone here today. My name is Amith Nagarajan. As Jill mentioned, I'm the founder and chairman of Blue Cypress, which is a family of purpose-driven companies. All of our companies are focused on helping not-for-profit organizations in various ways. My background is as a software entrepreneur. For the last 30 years or so, I've been starting and scaling software companies, primarily focused on helping nonprofits. And for the last almost 10 years, I've been working heavily in the AI arena. So I have several companies within our family at Blue Cypress that are in the AI space. So that's my background.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for joining us. And you now see Dray McFarlane, who's co-founder of a company called Tassio. This company uses AI and other data-driven tech in the association space, digging into member data. Dray, you're going to tell the story better than I do. Why don't you tell our group here a little bit about your connection to this technology?
Absolutely. And thanks for having me, Jill. Tassio is one of those companies that Amith mentioned that's part of the Blue Cypress family that's focused on AI. We've been working with AI to provide solutions for that nonprofit and association space for several years now. We've actually been using generative AI for a couple of years, even before ChatGPT came out. So the past 6 months have been a whirlwind of interest from the world at large on a topic that we've been pretty deep into for quite a while. So I'm really excited to talk to you all about it.
Yeah, both of you are going to add real value to this conversation, again, about the practical implications. Before we get started, as usual, I want to give you in this virtual room a way to listen and some things to grab on to and contemplate as we go. The first is change. This subject is massive. I am confident most, if not all of you, have experimented with this technology in one way or another. I suspect this conversation will open up some new ideas about the way your work or your organization's work could change. So be listening for that. And to that end, also be listening for, and we're going to be asking you at the end, where could you try? Where could you test and learn? At TRG, we talk about this all the time. Let's not get married to deep diving. Let's just test and learn and adapt. So where's an opportunity for you to do that today? And a reminder always, chat we can use, and we will be looking at it as we go through the session today. You can be talking to each other and us, but as you've got questions, put them in the Q&A. We've got time at the end of this session. We made it a bit longer just to ensure we weren't rushing away. We'll use as much time as we need to ensure that you can ask questions of our experts here. And so with that as an intro, Amith, you've been involved in this tech for a long time. It is a massive change in our working and otherwise world. Give us some perspective to kick us off.
Sure, I'd be happy to. The way I like to describe this is that we are at a moment in time that Andy Grove, one of the founders of Intel, would call an inflection point, meaning it's a phase change in business and society, really in the world at large. And the only comparable thing that I think is in relatively recent memory for society is flight. That is even comparable to what's happening with AI. I personally think that AI's impact will be far greater than flight, which is a big statement to make because flight obviously changed a lot. The way I think of it is that the world we live in today is used to a set of tools, and the tools that we've become accustomed to using are quite powerful, especially in the last 30 years with IT. But those tools, as advanced as they may seem right now, will be looked at as hand tools. And what we're about to go to are power tools. So how do we get here? Really what's happening is we're benefiting with AI and technology in general from exponential growth. Now, for those of you that aren't familiar with a term called Moore's Law, that's essentially Gordon Moore, who was another founder of Intel, he didn't coin the phrase Moore's Law, but he basically stated that computing power would double roughly every 18 months for the same price. And that was actually expressed as doubling the number of transistors on a chip by Gordon Moore. But Moore's Law essentially says that for the same dollar amount, you get double the computing power roughly every 18 months. So if you double and then double and then double again and again and again, you get an exponential curve. What you see on the screen right now is actually a curve that's expressed in a log scale. So that means that it's not nearly as real of an exponential effect as what's actually been experienced. It's more like this, like a vertical kind of thing if you looked at it in a linear chart. So the important part to take away from the chart is this. Going back to when computing first really started to enter our lives, we've had this consistent doubling of power, and that has led to all sorts of innovations. Now, AI is sitting on top of all that, and it's going to impact all of you in a very real way. A couple of things that I wanted to point out that I think are quite interesting. So this chart is showing the computational calculations per second per $1,000. And that's an interesting term, but like for outside of me and Dray in this call, I think we're probably the only computer nerds here. Maybe not, but like we think in that way. But for everyone else, here's a couple things on the right side of the chart that are interesting. Back in 2015, we surpassed the brain power of a mouse. And that was cool. So for $1,000 back in 2015, you could get one mouse full of computing power for $1,000. Seems like a great deal, right? And that seems like a far cry from our incredible species, right? But guess what? It's 2023, 8 years later, and that doubling keeps happening. So now $1,000 of compute power gets roughly the same processing power, not the same intelligence, but the same processing power as one human brain. Now, what's really interesting is if you fast forward based on this curve another 20 years, by 2045, $1,000 will buy you the computing equivalent of all human brains combined. So 8 billion plus people. And that's in 20 years. So that's what's going on. And so that, along with a couple of other exponential curves around bandwidth and data, are what's fueling AI. So that's the backdrop of why AI all of a sudden is like, it's amazing, right? Whereas if you're not in the AI field or in the computing field, probably up until this point, you haven't been thinking about AI nearly as much as you kind of have been forced into for the last 6 months. So that backdrop is important to understand because the thing that's happening is going to continue to happen, and it's going to happen faster. Just to give you one other data point, in the world of artificial intelligence, there's a different doubling cycle. And it's not 18 months, it's 6 to 9 months is what we're seeing right now. So we're seeing a doubling of artificial intelligence power for the same price point, roughly every 6 to 9 months. It's insane.
Yeah.
So that's what's going on.
Yeah. So let's talk some definitions, Amith. Let's just make sure folks understand AI.
Sure. So going back to the idea of like comparing this to flight, the big challenge that people think about is like when it talks about like what is AI? AI is, the way I like to describe to people who are outside of the technology realm is it's stuff that you wouldn't think a computer could do. It's essentially something that requires what seems to be like reasoning. Computers are great at calculations. We all know that it can compute all sorts of things, right? Calculating stuff, but judgment, reasoning, creativity, these are things that seem like they're outside of the domain of computing and are in the realm of sci-fi. And that's kind of where AI lives. AI is somewhere between traditional computing or accepted computing and sci-fi. So it's the things that would traditionally require a person. Machine learning, neural networks, and deep learning are really they're three different terms that kind of you can glob together in your mind as deeply computationally intensive statistics. So what machine learning and deep learning does and what neural networks do essentially is take mountains of data and translate it into a bunch of numbers, which then they're able to use to predict what the next set of numbers are going to be. That sounds like really simplistic, but as we go through these conversations, you'll find that the applications of that, if you do it at scale, are actually mind-boggling. So it's not so important that you understand, what's the difference between a neural network and a traditional machine learning algorithm. The point is that these are terms you'll see sprinkled around the world, even in newspapers like The Economist are talking about neural networks now. Just know that there are advances in the technology that enable this level of capability, which normally you would think requires a person. So we're going to get into a whole bunch of that in terms of examples, but that's the simplest definition, is something that you in your mind would traditionally think requires a person, like I need another employee to do that work.
Generative AI?
Yeah, so then a sub-branch of artificial intelligence that I think is going to really just blend into AI overall is this term generative. And it's kind of an interesting category because it means something that is being created out of, really out of the air in a sense. That's how it feels. It is a type of advanced deep neural net. So it's a really advanced thing that previously would not have been possible. Like if you go back in time to the point where $1,000 bought you a mouse brain in 2015, it would have been essentially impossible to do what we're doing today because it's incredibly computationally intensive. But what does generative AI actually do? It creates stuff. So it can create content like text, like images. It can create videos. It can create music. It can have conversations with you. And so one way to think about this is that people all think, like a lot of people think about AI as when am I going to get the Jetsons robot? Or when am I going to have Jarvis from Iron Man? Or when am I going to have like Hal, right? And these are the types of things people think of. And those are sci-fi, but they're not that far out there. They're still sci-fi. What you have right now, I really like the terminology Microsoft is using. They're calling it a co-pilot, which is a way to think about something that can help you create first drafts, something that can help edit your work, something that can summarize your work, something that can transpile your content from one format to another. For example, taking audio and making it a nice summary, taking the transcription from this meeting and turning it into a set of bullet points, and on and on. So we're going to get into a lot of examples, but generative AI is just a branch of AI that creates stuff.
I heard a wonderful podcast where a guy from George Mason University was talking about the impact on journalism. And he said, listen, the best writers will treat this as having all of a sudden 25 research assistants, 25 ways to make them better, faster, more creative. I like this term co-pilot too. It has a practical application, as we know, and we'll talk about. Dray, you have been practically using this, and the change every year has been pretty mind-boggling.
Yeah, absolutely. And for many people, this has been a journey of 6 months. But to highlight what Amith said, we have things that led to where we are today. Focusing specifically on generative AI, the current type of technology that we're using generally is accepted to have started in 2017. Google was doing a lot of research just to really focus on Google Translate. They were trying to improve their capabilities for translation. And if you were using it around then, there was an overnight jump in its capabilities, like drastic change in how much you could rely on that. And they released a paper on how they did this called Attention is All You Need. This was the first explanation of these transformer models. We're not going to get too deep on the technical side, but that transformer model papers provided the outline of how we're going to implement things all the way up to what we're seeing today. Pretty soon after that, GPT-1 came out. So OpenAI entered the ring and started using that transformer technology to produce another model that could then be used to be generative AI. This stage, it was pretty much a toy. It's kind of a neat demonstration of the technology, very few practical purposes. But very quickly followed by GPT-2. This got bigger, smarter, more data, more information. Suddenly it's able to produce content that actually looks like human wrote. It looks like it's human written. So it was hard to tell a difference between what the AI produced and what humans wrote. Didn't really have conversations that well, didn't follow instructions, but it really was good at starting to produce content and tie things together. Again, quickly after that, GPT-3, another jump in size, information, capabilities. That's where things started to get a little creepy. We started seeing posts about saying these companies are just producing blog posts using their AI. So GPT-3 back in 2020 is where we first started seeing, all right, this content was entirely written by AI. It wasn't great. I mean, it was kind of generic content and kind of see some of the similar things today, but now it was capable of doing that. 2021, we start seeing advancements in how we interact with GPT-3 and proving that it does have the capability to imitate reasoning. We often say now it can reason. It's not reasoning the same way people are, but it can imitate it very well. So that chain of thought is an explanation of how you interact with it in a way to imitate reasoning. 2022, we start seeing the ability to follow instructions. So you can now tell it to do something, write an email, write a blog post. Before that, you had to prompt it in certain ways to make it finish something for you. This is where you could start telling it to do things and it would do them. That was early 2022, and that really led us to the end of 2022, which feels like forever ago, but that was ChatGPT. ChatGPT was built on all of these separate pieces. Really, it was intended to be a demonstration of all of this. I don't think even OpenAI fully realized what was about to happen. They threw something out there like, hey, we've been playing with this technology for a little while. We'd love for other people to jump in, see it, try it out, see what they like, see what they don't like, help provide some feedback for our next version. I don't think they expected to have that massive takeoff, but within a month, quite a few people had seen this. This took off way faster than anything else.
Right.
Super exciting for me at this point because we had been using GPT-3 for membership retention purposes within the association space. We're having it help us write email marketing content in quite a few ways. Yeah. So it was something that we were very familiar with and could jump on and run with it. But things didn't stop there. ChatGPT is not the end. Like I said, they were hoping to train their additional models, help to learn more. Pretty quickly after that, OpenAI came out with GPT-4. We started seeing other players enter the ring, so we could actually add to this list quite a bit. Google just released Palm 2 recently, which is their latest model. And we're starting to see some development towards autonomous agents. So instead of this back and forth conversation, we're actually seeing bots interacting with bots to pursue more complex or lengthy tasks. And it's not stopping.
Well, and so these are the kinds of tools that we're now seeing on people's desktops in this room, I'm sure of it. These different Google and Microsoft, we talked about Copilot as a which of these are you using most often, Dray?
Personally, I use ChatGPT for my purposes. Bing is more targeted towards search. So these are things built on top of those generative AI models for different purposes. Yeah. ChatGPT is a little more open to interaction. Bing is a little more restricted to focusing on a task that Microsoft has set up for it. Bard is still developing. I like to go back and play with it every now and then to see how they're improving. But Google fell behind. Despite being the ones who wrote that paper back in 2017, they didn't quite open things up to the public in time, and they lost a bit of an opportunity for the public to provide feedback and actually guide their tools. So they're playing catch up. They're moving fast, though, because it is Google, and they know a lot.
Yeah. So we're going to be using ChatGPT in demonstration today, but as you both know, this room is full of people whose job it is to do this: fill concert halls, theaters, exhibit halls, and help this field recover. And I said this at the opening, the staffing stresses and impacts on the arts and cultural sector, certainly that's been global and felt everywhere, but this sector is still at a place where staffing levels aren't where they used to be. And if they are, there's a lot of new staff. So the time to deliver and the amount of work that it's taking to get to what used to be practices that they were familiar with, or to try and develop new practices, I'm confident that this technology can help accelerate some of that. So that's what we're going to be talking about today, is the practical implication and use of this in the arts and cultural and creative sector. As we've talked about it and have been testing it at TRG, as we've been learning from you, this is tech that can affect customers in our sector, our staff, even our board. We'll talk about that. And there are 3 categories of things that we're going to break down. Dray and I are going to be talking about these 3 areas that generative AI or AI can be helpful with in your day in and day out work. Please chat with us as we go through. Again, put your questions in Q&A. We'll answer them on a one-on-one basis at the end of our time together. But the three areas are create. How can this tech help you create? And as Amith suggested, help you develop so that you can take a draft and go from there. Summarize and market. So let's, Dray, you and I start to talk through these individual examples, and I'll just give you all a heads up that what I've done is identify a couple, three areas that I have seen our clients trying, the field trying, we're using within TRG, and my prompts and my approach is subpar. On purpose here, so that as we get to the end of these examples that I'm going to step us through, Dray is actually going to show us how we could be doing it differently in real time so that you can get a practical sense of how this tech might be used. Okay, so the first is brainstorming for creative ideas, blogs, social media content, copy. It's likely that you all have been trying this. This is a real example that I put into my ChatGPT instance. Here's a successful blog on LinkedIn. I'd like to write more. I'd like it to not be redundant, and ChatGPT returned some examples. So that's the first. It's one that I'm using regularly. I suspect all of you are. Dray is going to come back and show us an example of how we might get a better result in this case, and some others, including this next one. Event ideas. So you all have member events, subscriber events, donor events. Here you see what I thought was a pretty decent request for brainstorming or creating a framework for an event that's a 100th anniversary event that takes place in a particular month, that has a particular sort of format and tone that it wants to have. So that's the question I asked of the prompt, and ChatGPT came back with a whole string of operational and other ideas for this gala event for this theater company celebrating its 100th anniversary. The third I heard about in January. Actually, I was at an Orchestra League conference in America and learned that some administrators were using ChatGPT to begin the process of program note drafting for program books, which raised some eyebrows in the room. You can see how I asked this question. I want you to draft program notes for Carl Orff's Carmina Burana, and let's write it in a particular style so that it's friendly and readable by the layperson. Boy, the key here is proofing, as it is everywhere. These are research assistants. If you had a fresh out of or newly experienced, regardless, staff member, you would need to do the proofing. No different here, but it does take that first drafting off of your desk and speed to delivery. And finally, with the use of systems like Dolly and some others that Dray, you're going to describe for us, I was really curious about how we might expand our photographic library for those kinds of shots that we may not have enough of, audience shots or customers and patrons in a lobby. I tried this myself and got some really funny photos, Dray, like really funny noses and really funny just body renderings of people. I wonder if you could take us, maybe starting here and working backwards from some of these examples. I'm going to stop sharing and allow you to take us and show us how this might work differently and better.
Sure, and we're going to be focused on walking through the examples on the text ones, but let's talk to the image generation really quickly. So you use things like Dolly and Stable Diffusion. They're really cool because they're free to access. You can go play with them right now. But partially because they're free to access, at least the free versions, you might not have as much control, and it can be a little more challenging to get really photorealistic pictures. There are a lot of pieces of content out there about how to talk to it in ways that will improve that quality of content. But there are also other tools. I think the most popular that I've run into lately is Midjourney. It's a little harder to get into. If you are familiar with Discord, that's how you tend to interact with Midjourney, which is a little different from opening up a browser. But the quality of pictures that I see coming out of it tends to be significantly better. You can control it. You can provide a lot of information about how you would expect a camera to work. And suddenly it's producing things that look like there was a photographer. Now, with that, let's go back to those text examples. I think you sold yourself a little short on some of those, Jill. I think they were very good examples. there are a couple things about them that I particularly liked. First, just to kind of address a theme running here, you're not really asking for facts. You're not asking ChatGPT, can you answer this complicated, deep question that I would normally have to do a lot of research about? Very often, GPT does have a lot of information. It's been trained on a lot of things out there in the internet. But once you start asking it to give you factual answers, that's where you're opening the door for it to potentially start going down a path you don't like, or you have to fact check. That's kind of the big concern and complaint with this right now. So I like that your examples are actually focused on improving your productivity in ways that aren't necessarily answering questions. This isn't a search engine, shouldn't be treated like one. It's creative. And because it's creative, that means it can be creative with other things than just what you want it to be. So awesome choices on your examples, and the way you use them. I'm going to highlight a couple pieces of that. So actually, before I even talk about, I'm going to use the donor event in particular as an example to dig into. But before I get there, your social media content was perfect. That's actually why I don't have anything to add here, because you threw out the question of what you wanted to do, but you also provided it with a lot of content. So when you said, here's some text from a successful post, you gave it a lot to work with. That gave it your voice, so your tone of voice that you tend to write in, that gave it information that you've been talking about, that gave it a lot of jumping off points and structure that it can use to then produce more content. I saw a question over in the Q&A about whether this is actually creative or just pattern recognition and working off of that. Ultimately, it's so complicated pattern recognition that it's hard to tell a difference between that and being creative. So when we say, sometimes we call these complicated next word completion engines, they're more than that just because of the complexity behind it. So while we consumed millions, billions, trillions of pieces of information, it's not going out there and saying, all right, when I say the word host, what is the most likely word to follow that? It's combining a lot of patterns over the course of what it's been fed to produce full sentences afterwards. So it is patterns, but it is so complicated beyond that that it is very hard to tell between that reasoning, creativity, and all these other things that we do as humans. Okay, that was a lot of talking instead of actually playing with ChatGPT. So what I've done, just so we didn't have to sit here and watch it rewrite this, I went ahead and asked the question that Jill brought up on the slide. So I want to host a donor event in June, gave it some specifications about the reason for the event, style for the event, pricing, specific things that we're asking it for, and we're asking it to be creative. The reason I love this is you're very specific in what you want. You're giving it very specific instructions in terms of being creative, what you want ideas for, so you're asking for an outline. You've even given it some background information that you could have just said, hey, give me an outline for an event. I think a lot of people go to ChatGPT and do that. And then when the content that comes back is very, very generic and not great, they walk away saying, well, this AI was neat, but I'm not going to use it.
Right. It's the prompt, right? It's the power of the question.
And the thing here is there's a lot around prompt engineering. You can go out and find a ton of content about how to properly interact with these tools. I kind of hate that people are getting so into that because the technology is evolving so fast that prompt engineering isn't really going to be a thing. All the little tricks and tools that people use to get certain types of responses, they're not necessary long-term. The things you had to do to produce something like this back in February, we don't have to do today. So as it's getting smarter, the prompting is getting easier, but still providing information and context will always be powerful. So this is a great prompt that I think is future-proof. Whereas if I started using, I think there's a do anything now type prompts, that stuff is a waste of time probably in the next couple of months.
The other thing I'd want to add to the mix is, especially for those of you that haven't used these tools much, is if you had an employee and you went to them and you gave them like a really poor description of what you wanted, you'd probably get something pretty limited back. Think of it that way, right? You want to give a descriptive, the better the description, the better the job you do communicating what you want, the more likely you are to get something outstanding in return.
All right, so with Jill's prompt here, the result that we got back is going to be different from what she got. It is creating something new each time we run this. So if we didn't like this, we could start from scratch. But one thing I want to remind people is this, again, isn't a search engine. We didn't just put something in and what we got is what we got. We can interact with this. So we go through, we have some good food ideas, some decoration ideas, some activity ideas. Maybe some things appeal to us. Maybe we want to dig into those. Maybe this didn't quite hit the mark. Let's say, we've got some activity ideas here, doing some behind the scenes tours, some interactive art displays, some theatrical performances. I'm a little concerned. So we're expecting quite a crowd and have pretty limited space. So I'm going to provide some restrictions. So I'm going to say, all right, you gave me some ideas for activities, but I really want to do something with this. So we're probably not going to be able to pursue those. So let's say try again. Actually, I can even treat it like a person.
Mm-hmm.
And that allows us to say, do you see any issues with those? It allows it to be a pretty open-ended question. And then it allows it to go back, review what it already did, and provide some updates. So based on that issue with space or potential issue with space, it's going back through those items that we had. So it's still looking at the theatrical performances, the tours, the art displays. But it's saying, based on those, here are some ideas that might allow you to work within a limited amount of space. These are pretty good ideas to me. Again, not my area of expertise, but this allowed me to go back and forth and say, all right, this was something that I have a concern about. How could I mitigate that?
Dray, I really like what Amith said. It's a paradigm shift in thinking about this. Like, this isn't an app. This could be viewed like an additional staff person, right? Mm-hmm. It could be viewed like an enhancement of your current staff. And I just wonder how that insert changes the paradigm of thinking in this room. I would want it to. Please continue. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, and the other side to this is I could have included this information in that first prompt, but I do like actually taking things step by step. By allowing it to answer a more generic question, sometimes we'll allow it to prime itself on the information. We gave enough information to get a decent quality answer, but then digging in allows us to get really high quality instead of trying to be too specific up front. So there's a bit of a balance. Again, treat it like a conversation with a person. Mm-hmm. So we gave enough information for the person to be able to engage in that conversation, to start down the right path, and then we can dig in. Now, let's say I'm looking at the food ideas here. Great food ideas. Again, maybe we have some limitations, but maybe they're not going far enough. Concession stand delights. I get the theme that it's going for. I see this all over the place. This is something that maybe I've seen before. I wanted to try something new. We're going to pretend we're in this amazing world where budget is not an issue. That is
totally is the case in arts and culture, nonprofit.
Absolutely, everyone has as much money as they want, so we're gonna go wild here. Again, being creative today. The concession stand idea for food seems a little too plain, maybe overdone. And we're just, again, I'm not using any particular structure to this. Conversational, you can type and talk to it however you need to. You can use slang. I actually love that you used the word fussy, Jill. That was fantastic. Yeah. So this allows us to start testing things and going back and forth. So you don't have to be happy with the first result. That doesn't mean that it was a bad result. It means that you can dig in, just like you would if you were dealing with a person.
It's a great example. Look at the specificity of these responses. Hey, while we're here, IP, who owns it?
So in this case, these are just general ideas for you, so it's probably not as much of an issue. But if we were having it write content, so we're actually going to talk about those program notes in a second.
Yeah.
One thing I would suggest is that if you don't provide much information in your prompts, it's going to be very hard for you to claim ownership. This is an area that is still evolving. People are trying to figure out where the borders are exactly. But I'd say the way to future-proof yourself is to make sure you're providing as much information, as much character, as much of yourself as you can when you're asking it to produce things.
Well, let's go there, actually, because we've got a lot of good questions in the Q&A, and I want to make sure we get through all the content. That's a really important question, actually.
It's extremely important. And that is where this gets kind of fun. So I took your prompt on the program notes example exactly as is and let it go and do its thing. This is an area where I have little to no expertise. But even to me, it kind of jumps out that it automatically filled in the rest of the program.
It did.
So,
funny.
If it happened to be you were looking for ideas on how you should program it, great.
Who needs artistic directors? We'll just, I'm joking. I'm so joking right now.
Uh,
I'm not serious.
yeah, I'm probably not happy with this result. Now, the reason it gave us this is because we left it open-ended. We said draft some program notes, and it basically says, all right, well, let's throw some program notes together. This is a realistic example of program notes, I guess. Realistic to your particular situation, maybe, maybe not.
Right.
Now, as someone who doesn't have expertise here, I would want to take a different approach. One, you could just provide a lot more information in your prompt like we did in the other one, but here's a slightly different way to tackle let's create content. Here's something where I'm going to tell it what I need to do. So my goal is what I'm going to start with. I'm going to give it some guidelines for that goal. Then I'm going to tell it that it's really smart. Like, all right, ChatGPT, you're really good at this, which feels extremely weird to be effective, but it is very effective to tell it that it is good at something. And then ask for these steps, and then what maybe questions I need to ask for what additional details I'm going to need as part of this process. Going back to that question about pattern recognition, telling it that it's smart is going to direct us down certain paths in those patterns. Because a realistic answer here might also be an incorrect answer. A lot of people are not smart. A lot of people are not good at this. If you ask me to put together program notes, I'm going to get it wrong, but I might have examples of that out in the training data. So it is just as likely that it's going to give you something that Dray wrote as something that someone who is much more of an expert wrote. So telling it to be smart means that it's going to limit its selections to those that were smart answers.
Okay, in this example, who owns the IP?
That answer is still there's a lot of complexity to that. I wanted to add one quick thing to Dray's, and I can share a couple of thoughts on IP ownership as well. But what Dray was saying about telling the AI that it's smart, telling it you're an expert financial analyst, evaluate my financial statement for this year or whatever, like all these things, it sounds really weird, because going back to what I said earlier, treat it like an employee. If you have a CFO, you probably wouldn't go to your CFO and say, you're an expert chief financial officer. You kind of expect that from the CFO of your organization, or from a marketing person, you're an expert marketer. But just to dig into what Dray's saying earlier, right now these systems are such that they do not care about giving you the best answer. They care about best predicting what the next sequence of text would be based on what you provided, which sounds really weird. But by simply priming it with this prompt that says you're an expert analyst, you're a helpful assistant, whatever these prompts might say, you get a radically different answer. So that's something I really encourage all of you to note in your experimentation with ChatGPT and other tools, is to tell it what you want it to be. It's like playing make-believe. You're an expert in performing arts. You're an expert in this. You're an expert in that. Again, sounds weird, but I can't underscore how important that is with the current era of technology. Now, I would suspect, like Dray's comments on prompt engineering, which I agree with wholeheartedly, 12 months from now, you might not need to do that. But right now you do. So right now it's important to know that, because that separates the average user who has an okay experience with ChatGPT with people who are using it literally as part of their daily work, like he and I are. As far as the IP ownership question goes, I think that's a great one to dig into over time. Dray already mentioned really the key framework question is, what percentage was AI created versus how much of it was created by the human? In copyright law, the USPTO about a month and a half ago, I think, released a statement saying that copyright extends to human created works, right? Which is the intention, as opposed to machine created works. But then, of course, that leaves open the question of what's machine created. When do you cross that boundary to machine created versus created by a person? And there is no guidance on that. I'm not a copyright expert by any means. I'm not an attorney. That's not my background. But my understanding of it is very simple, is that, right now there's a very, very high level understanding that the more it's machine built and the less human built, the more likely it is that you can't get copyright protection. So the more you interact with it through prompting or through transcription or whatever you're providing as your inputs, the more likely you are to have copyright protection.
Okay. While we're on this subject, I see the term AI spellcaster. It's around this prompt engineering, I think. I don't know. Have you heard that term?
I haven't.
New job skill at a recent conference. Great term for this. Spellcaster. Super interesting. More terms to come, I suspect.
I like that, because you might think of spellcaster as someone who's causing things to happen with their words. So we don't have to necessarily be programming things to make it happen.
Yeah, as we think about these labels and the work, it really reinforces the power of the human plus the system, right? The better, the more clear we are, the more descriptive we are, the more prompts and our own experience and intelligence and backgrounds we bring to this, the better the result, the more protected we are. That directionally feels, at least right now, easy-ish to understand.
And I'll wrap up this example with exactly that. So part of the reason you do this, even if you are the expert in this case and know everything you need, you're priming this process, and both to protect your IP and to make sure that it's producing high quality output. You're basically telling it, here's how we're going, or the things that we care about, by letting it tell you what it needs to know. And then you can start providing those pieces of information. And at the end of it, it's going to produce a piece of content based on everything you provided. It would be very hard to say that is not your content.
Yeah.
So taking it step by step, provided a lot of information, treat it like a person. Pretty simple rules.
Really, really key. Okay, so you were using a version of ChatGPT, Dray, and there are two, one that's free 3.5 and one that's $20 a month 4.0. Can you just talk about the differences there real quick?
Yeah, really quick. One reason I use 3.5 in these particular examples is that it is very smart, so it's still very effective. The free version is fantastic. It's also quite a bit faster. So when I'm demoing, I tend to use 3.5 because it'll actually write something in a reasonable amount of time for a demo. But 4 is a big leap in intelligence, especially reasoning. So that jump to say you don't need as much prompt engineering to be able to make it go down certain paths, 4 is a jump past 3.5. So the paid version allows you to be a bit more loose with your prompting and get much higher quality results. It is a little slower, and it is the paid version, but it is a fantastic result. If we do have technical people in the room, it is way ahead in terms of writing reliable code. That's what I tend to use it for on a daily basis.
I also was shocked to learn that 3.5, the data that was input to create it ended at the end of September. Is that right?
That's right. So each of these models is trained through a certain period of time as far as the data that it's fed, and then it goes through a long process of being trained with additional human feedback. So all of these models are outdated in terms of the data they have in place. 4 might be through the end of 21 or beginning of 22, but none of them are up to date currently. One thing that the paid version and 4 in particular has is that they're starting to build in plugins. I think we're talking a bit about more in the later slides, but one thing that it does allow here is you could plug into a browser or a search engine. So potentially you can get more up-to-date information if it finds the right information.
Feels like that's going to be key, doesn't it? I mean, this at the speed of information just feels like 4 is going to be a good, Amith, go.
If you're asking for anything that's fact-based, you probably need to go to 4.
Yeah.
It's also much less likely to hallucinate.
Yeah, okay. Okay, let's go to the next couple of examples. We're just going to identify them, talk about them really quick. I think we've mentioned them, but gone are the days when we have to have a human body summarizing information for us, right? So if we're doing that today, I think we really need to think about how we stop the madness. So whether we are today, even past this pandemic time, so much Zoom and team meeting, that meeting audio can be summarized. AI can create a first draft of that. I watched a webinar, Amith, that you and Dray and some others did. Staff meetings, certainly this could happen, but even board meetings. But again, it's not like you'd have the text summarize a board meeting where there might be sensitive content and then shoot it out. As a human, you'd review it and make sure that it met your needs. But it just takes that first step out of the need of a human being. You can also summarize this kind of stuff, right? Articles and open-ended survey results. And Dray, you have some real experience with chat and conversation recordings and other things. This is something that is newish in our field, but chatbots on websites, recordings of telemarketing, telefunding, box office, where you want to use it for training or you want to diagnose an issue.
Yeah, absolutely. And the key here is we use summarize as a way to capture this, way to summarize what we're talking about. But really, we're talking about understanding content. The reason we summarize it is so we can understand it more quickly. So for conversations and chat logs, I don't want to sit there and review a conversation that had a ton of back and forth or maybe long email threads the same way. I could ask for a summary, and I could ask for it to format that as a list of bullets of the main points. I could then ask for tone. I could say, was this person happy when they were talking to me? Were they upset when they called us? There's a lot of pieces of information that it can pull out of this content to make it much easier for us to digest as humans, especially if you're on the customer service side and you're getting a phone call coming in right now. You don't have time to read a long history of emails or long conversations. You'd have to put them on hold for several minutes to get an idea of what had been happening before. This helps short circuit that drastically by saying, here's what's important, here's what's recent, and doing it in a very short and understandable way.
Yeah, I think this is a new frontier of application for our sector for sure. Let's get to a really interesting one. I suspect for folks in this room, whether you're in marketing or fundraising, all of this is right offer to right person at right time, right? So how the applications here are pretty significant. I'm going to step through these and then both of you can comment on them. Test development for content that is about an event, an experience like membership or subscription. You see an example here of a description of an event and then a summary that might be turned into headlines, intro paragraphs, copy blocks, as we're working to create tests between different approaches. A key thing that you said to me, Dray, was put a lot of input in here. Again, going back to this IP conversation, and ask it to reduce it down. What else would you say here?
So I think we talked a lot about creating content in the previous examples, so won't go too far into that because marketing is a lot of creating content. But the time savings associated with this is sometimes crazy because marketers have produced a lot of content, but creating variations on that is almost as equally time consuming as creating the first piece.
Right.
This allows you to create variations with extremely little effort. Definitely spend your time to get a high quality base, but once you have that, let the bots go.
I think the part of the challenge of test and learn and A/B testing in arts and culture is a fear that we don't ever want to put out a subpar. So we're going to pick the best because we need the best result. So there's that. But it's also just we don't have the time to do it. And this is a click of a button sort of. The other one is segmentation. I saw it in the chat too, but this is a place where you've really been doing a lot of work. And you can describe customers based on their past history. Are they lapsed? How long have they been since the pandemic? Do they buy once, or are they a long time customer? Are they demographically different, geographically different? There's all these kinds of inputs you can put in that enables copy to be tailored in draft form that you can work from.
Yeah, and it's been beautiful to work with this, to be honest. So from my technical background, I'd been creating marketing segmentations for years where I'd have to say, all right, here are the different variations that I want because they make sense to me or to the people that I talk to. Now I can basically say, here's a bunch of users, here's some content that I have that's a baseline, tailor this to those users. And I don't mean in segments, I mean individually. So it's writing to Amith, writing to Jill based on their interests, their previous interactions, things that are very, very personalized that I don't care how big your organization is, you could never have done that before. It just wasn't something, you're not replacing people with this. You're allowing people to do things that just didn't exist before this type of technology.
Yeah, right. Okay. So yes, the deck will be sent. Yes, there will be a recording. You'll get access to all of this. I'm glad it's valuable to you. So 3 categories we talked about: create, summarize, and market. I want to get us to your questions, but before I do that, Amith, I just let's pull up just a little bit. We've talked a bit about it, but just the future and some of the issues out there. Take us through some of your thoughts there.
Sure. Well, actually, I want to start on this slide talking about the comment Dray just made in terms of doing things you previously couldn't have done. And so that's one of the ways to frame the AI conversation. So yes, AI can do what you currently do. And can it do it better? Can it do it faster? Can it do it cheaper? The answer is yes to most categories already. It will be yes definitively in the next couple of years. But the even more exciting, and that's exciting in a lot of ways. It has some concerns. There's been some questions in the chat about like job displacement. It's the question of our time really for society at large, not just our individual organizations. The bigger opportunity though, on the other side of that is that which you cannot do without AI. So doing what you currently do better, faster, cheaper, cool, that's exciting. But what's more exciting is to do things at a different level of capability. And that's a lot of what the future of AI is going to be focused on, is to extend capabilities, to come up with new ways of essentially harnessing our creativity and delivering it at scale in a truly personalized manner. The speed at which this is happening is stunning. Even to Dray and myself, who've been in this field for years and years and years, it's hard to keep up. Frankly, I find it overwhelming. Just reading the news and more technical papers and staying up to date with what's going on is very hard. Not to mention the work we're doing trying to drive innovation ourselves in our respective fields. But the most important thing is to be aware. So I always tell people when I talk about AI, there's 3 steps in my playbook. First is awareness, which is different than education. Awareness is basically opening your mind to let the information come in. It's not necessarily to try to learn it, but it's to open your mind. And a lot of people, for different reasons, right? They might be busy, they might have a negative perception of AI, whatever. They just keep their mind closed. And if you do that, you have basically no chance of really doing anything successfully in the future, in my opinion, because AI is going to be the tool, again, going back to what I started with, the ultra capable power tools versus the hand tools. So you have to be ready for that change. So awareness, and then of course, education, which is a deeper investment to then finally get to experimentation. The experts themselves are terrible at predicting what's going to happen next. And part of that is, again, all of us, no matter whether we're in arts or whether we're in AI, our brains through evolution are hardwired to predict what's happening in a linear fashion. So looking at what happened in the last 6 months, I expect some of the same for the next 6 months. That's just how our brains work. That's how we go and find food. That's how we find shelter. It's a survival instinct, through millions of years of evolution. But all of a sudden, we're in an exponential world. And so even the experts who know about this stuff way better than I do, they're having a hard time predicting what's next. So it's really hard to, figure out what's happening there. Again, what I'm trying to underscore for all of you is you don't need to be the expert in AI, but you have to be aware of it and you have to pay attention to this stuff and play with it and experiment. There are new capabilities coming that are going to be even more sentient-like. I wouldn't call it sentient because I don't think, personally, my view is AI is never going to have consciousness, and that's a philosophical conversation, not a technical one. But can they simulate it well? Can they do things at a level that seem like reasoning, that seem like really good judgment? And future models that are coming, that are in the works now, some that are probably already there, but we don't know about yet, are far more advanced than what we have access to now. GPT-4 was actually finished in kind of the spring of 2022 and wasn't released till almost a year later, like 9 months later, and because they were testing it and doing a lot of work called red teaming, which is to try to basically have it do bad stuff in order to stop it from doing those bad things. So I guess the point is that if you're not aware and if you don't get on this train of learning about it, you're gonna have a hard time keeping up. You're gonna have a really hard time with personally and in your organization. So to me, the most important thing is to stay on top of this stuff and to play with it, and then to find reasonable use cases that you can start to deploy to take advantage of it.
On the risk side, we don't have to spend a lot of time here. Is there anything you'd say?
Yeah, like that guy in the picture there, I'd be worried if he showed up at my house. So there are risks. There's the Terminator existential risks types things, which maybe they're tomorrow and maybe they're maybe they're never, maybe they're in 100 years. But there are risks today that we have to be aware of. The first thing is the risk of just not paying attention to this stuff. And what happens there is we don't know the difference between content created by the AI versus our own. So we can very easily say, oh, this looks pretty good. I'm just going to publish it, or I'm going to go with it without paying attention. You wouldn't do that with an employee. You shouldn't do that with the AI either. So you got to pay attention to this stuff. There are risks with respect to intellectual property that we talked about. There are risks with respect to biases. That was one of the things that was mentioned in Q&A. Our biases. So one of the things about AI is, I'll digress just for a moment. People think the computer is biased, and it is, but that's simply because you are, and I am, and all of us are. And so when you see your data, plain and simple, right in front of you, it's hard to look at sometimes. Dray and I used to work for a company where we did kind of like a CRM type database. And one of the features of that product was it made your data really easy to look at. And people are used to having data in their CRM systems that they can hardly get access to. And then they put it in our product and they're like, oh, your product's terrible. It's the worst thing in the world. And we're like, what do you mean? And we're like, well, our data is complete garbage. We're like, well, that's actually what your data looks like. You just had never seen it before. And so the point is that you have to think of it in the same lens. And you have to think of it, zooming back to the AI conversation, that if you're looking at the whole risk factor, you can end up with a lot of garbage, and you have to really keep that top of mind. From a biases perspective, that's what the garbage is I'm referring to. And we all have biases. So these systems do have bias. You have to look for that, just like brand new employee. Think of it that way. You would have guardrails in terms of how you think about it. From an ethics perspective and the zooming out, the macro factors, there's a lot of issues. I mean, job displacement. So Dray and I are both software guys, right? So we have spent a lot of our time writing code. I will tell you right now that, in my opinion, 50% or more of software development that we do right now manually will be eliminated in the next couple of years. Probably more like 80%. And there's millions of people around the world who do software development. And most people wouldn't think software developers are amongst the first people to lose their jobs due to AI, but they will be. Now, the best software developers will be 20, 50, 100 times more productive. But the average software developer, it's like, okay, so from the perspective of what do you do with that? It's like, I don't know the answer to that. There's a lot of great conversations happening. It's like, what do you do in the world? How do you deal with that? What I would tell you, though, is that your individual microcosm of your organization, if you try to take a stand on it and say, no, we're not going to embrace it because we're going to protect the jobs in our organization, and no one else is, I don't know, that's something for you to think about. But I think you have to look at ways to take advantage of this stuff while keeping in mind, what does that mean? And if you're doing so much better, maybe that results in even more wealth creation globally that solves for that. But that's like outside of the scope of what we can really talk about. The main thing is it's a big deal. The point I would say is, ultimately, your opinion on it is interesting, but it doesn't necessarily matter in terms of what's going to happen next. What's going to happen next is this technology is going to relentlessly keep marching forward, and nothing any of us wants to do or is doing will stop that. The technology is in an exponential curve, and there's literally millions of people working on advancing it. And the best chance we have at making AI do good work for society is to build really good AI that's focused on that. Because I guarantee you that right now, there are a lot of people that are working on creating really bad AI.
When you and I had supper together in New Orleans, Amith, I concluded that the best application right now will be to turbocharge creative people, and the people who are open and using it, their work will be made faster, more creative, better. And that's what I want this group to be thinking about. Like, we are a group of creatives. Let's be creative and have this tech be a turbocharger to that creativity and productivity. So let's talk about next steps. Thank you, Amith and Dray. Dray, take us here to the wrap up before we get to questions. At TRG, we're always talking about, what do you do next? What are the next steps? Amith mentioned some of them, Dray, but you're talking with folks about this all the time. Why don't you take us here?
Yeah, and kind of reiterate Amith's point right at the very beginning. Find a way to experiment, be involved, try things out, test things for yourself. This is actually probably a fantastically low risk time period to try these things.
Yeah.
Amith showed you that technology is marching on, processing power is marching on. Right now, we have that blend of, we have enough for AI to work, for us to play with it, to see what it can do, how it can do it. But it's still not super fast. Like, it's not instantaneously completing these massive tasks. I ask it a question and it takes 20 to 30 seconds to respond completely. So it's not going to go completely off the rails. I can play with it now. I should play with it now to get a feel for what it does before suddenly it's too fast for me to monitor. Make this a part of your day-to-day activities. That could be at work. So anything you're thinking of doing, throw it into ChatGPT, try to get some assistance. Takes 5 to 10 minutes at a time. Just see what it can do, see what it can't do, see where you're struggling. And in your personal life as well. If you have anything that you want to plan out, you can help it schedule your day. You can ask questions about, hey, my dog is doing this, how could I help correct their behavior? I've used that a couple of times. She's wandering around in the background right now. But also keep consuming content like this. Just keep getting ideas. Things are changing quickly. This is one of many presentations Amith and I have done on this topic, and every time we do, we have to rewrite our slides because every 2 weeks, a lot of this content changes. The rules change, the technology changes, the approaches change. Things are happening fast. It's hard to keep up. I saw one of the questions in chat was, how do you keep up?
Yeah.
I spend a lot of time with YouTube on in the background. So when I'm doing other things around my house, I'm constantly consuming some kind of news or media. But you're never going to be able to keep up completely. try and get some kind of summary on a weekly or bi-weekly basis. I think that's pretty good for most people.
Yeah, good. Okay, guys, let's go to some of these questions that are in the Q&A. I'm just going to go down the line. Does AI really create stuff, or is it just extremely efficient at determining patterns? We've talked a little bit about that. Is there a quick add to this?
I got my piece in. Amith, did you want to add to it?
I mean, the short answer is it's predicting what's next, right? So it's not necessarily creating anything new. It's based on patterns, but the question is how does that apply to people as well? Because everything we create is based on the collective sum of what we've learned so far in our lives. So in some ways, there's a parallel to our own creative capacity. It's different, but you can think of it that way. So it's more of a philosophical question than a technical one.
Susan also asked about, you can read it here, but these conference on robot learning, intelligent robots and systems, how you stay informed. I mean, you said stay informed and get content. How do you do that?
Well, I think what you read needs to be calibrated to the level of depth you want to get into in your technical, expertise and desire to get technical. Some of the stuff that Dray and I look at probably would be uninteresting to many of the people here, but there's a couple of resources that I think would be great for folks here. One is a group called the Marketing AI Institute, which is another company that we're affiliated with, and they are essentially at the intersection of all things marketing and all things AI. So it's marketingaiinstitute.com. They have a great newsletter. There's a podcast that comes out every week from their founder that's fantastic, where he covers in lay terms, but in significant depth, what's going on with AI. That's one place I always point people to. We have a company called Sidecar, which the website for that is sidecarglobal.com. You can register there to get a 3 times a week newsletter, heavily on AI content, and it's for not-for-profit professionals. That's what Sidecar is focused on. And there's a bunch of other resources, but I think those 2 sites are great places for not-for-profit folks to start getting up to speed. I really think the most important thing, though, is to focus on what you're interested in. There's so much content out there. It's kind of like with exercise, there's no prescriptive thing that says, hey, do this, go run, go cycle. It's like, do what you're going to keep doing. Mm-hmm. And so with this stuff, read what you're interested in. So if you're really interested in visual arts, read all about that part of AI. So I think that's the most important thing, is to read what you're going to read, or focus on what you're going to actually enjoy.
Bryce asks, one of the questions that's pretty sensitive. It's about job replacement in essence. Adobe Beta AI saves him time. Does it replace graphic designers? The writer's strike. I tossed off a joke about we don't need artistic directors. That is so clear that that's not true. But how would you calm the fears of creatives who feel like, oh, this is gonna put me out of work?
I'll talk about it in terms of software developers again, because that's something that I know a lot more about than your field. But I think software developers should be afraid of this stuff if they don't pay attention to it. And I think they should be afraid of it anyway, because fear of something new is not bad. Just because Dray and I are in this doesn't mean we're not. We have a healthy dose of both skepticism in some ways and fear, which is appropriate and evolutionary wired in, right? But the point is this: you are guaranteed to be on the out if you don't embrace this stuff. The only people in these fields who will be successful are the ones who know how to use the power tools. So if you're going around with hand tools or no tools at all, how do you expect to compete in software development or writing or anything else? So I do think it's a valid question. I think it's an extremely valid concern. I think the pace at which this stuff is progressing, there absolutely will be large numbers of jobs lost. Now, every time in our history, where we've had major technological innovation, from the printing press through the weaving loom, through all these other periods of time, industrial revolution, there's been job losses and also new job creation in ways we would not have guessed, right?
Right.
So while that's true, there are no telephone switchboard operators anymore, but there's a lot of other jobs that came from telecom becoming really inexpensive. Will that happen with AI? I think the answer is absolutely yes, but will it happen fast enough to address the job losses that are happening fairly soon? I don't know. So I think it's a valid concern. Again, that's a macro thing. But what I can guarantee you to be true is, as much as I can guarantee anything, is if you don't use this stuff, you will likely not be replaced by AI, by the way, by itself. You are very likely to be replaced by someone who knows how to use AI.
Go, Dray, please.
I'm sorry. One thing that I love about this question, I've had my eye on it since you asked it several minutes ago. I'd love to steal this from my co-founder at Tassio, Thomas. His big thing that I find very exciting and optimistic on my end is that AI is freeing us up to do things that make us more human. All those tedious tasks that we have to
Love
do
that
that AI
phrase.
can do,
Yeah,
let it do those and then become more creative. Spend your time doing the things that AI can't do because that's what makes us us.
right.
So hopefully society and everything else can keep up and we won't see too much displacement. Like Amith said, we don't have a ton of control over that. So trying to adapt is better than trying to fight it, probably. Keep asking this question. So as you adopt things, ask this question: am I using it responsibly? Am I using it ethically? Is this stealing content from people? Because that I would oppose. But if
Right.
it's just stealing time that they had to spend doing something tedious, I wouldn't fight that so much. Try and let them do something that is actually better as a human.
Yeah, I think a related topic that I think frames the discussion a little bit is not thinking about the workforce today, but the workforce of the future also, which is related. I'm sure many of the people on this call have kids, school-age kids. You know, my oldest is entering into sophomore year this fall in high school. And so, and I was just talking to him the other day, and he said, you know, like, do you have any idea what you want to do when when you're done with school? He's like, well, it's like, maybe I'll study law. I'm like, oh, that's interesting. So I thought about that for a minute. Okay, he's got 3 years of high school. He's got 4 years of undergrad and then 3 years of law school. So that's 10 years of education between now and then. So that would put him graduating from law school in May, June of 2033, 10 years from now, which is like an alien time frame in terms of like what that means of the doubling every 6 to 9 months of AI. So the question is, as a parent, you know, independent of whatever my opinion is about that field, do I encourage him to go into that field or not? Because it's a 10-year time frame. How do you predict whether that will be a great job or it'll be impossible to find a job in law in 10 years? I don't know the answer to that, but I do think that the folks that are part of this community really have a very interesting opportunity, because creativity and being human is such a part of not only our existence, obviously, but something that computers are really bad at.
Right.
And will probably continue to be really bad at for a long time. So I think there's an opportunity here to really, really take advantage of this stuff and focus in the areas that Dray just mentioned.
This is a good transition to the question that's next around about training and management, really. And to this point, AI isn't going to mentor, train employees. AI may make tasks faster, and it may be a tool we want to train teams to use, but management and professional development and coaching is something that humans do with humans. Would you agree?
100%. I think that once again, there's an opportunity to be a better coach, to be a better leader, to be a better manager. But ultimately, like what I'm in business for, like people ask me about my last company that I sold a few years ago, and like, what are you most proud of? I get that question from time to time, or what do you like to talk about the most? And to me, honestly, the thing that is most rewarding is the people that I had an opportunity to work with, coach, mentor, lead, work alongside, and the things they've gone on to do. That is what I'm most proud of. That's what I'm excited about. And I don't think AI is going to replace that. I think it's going to free up more of my time to do more of that, to work with more people, particularly earlier career professionals, and help guide them and grow them. That to me is super, super exciting. So I focus on that a lot. I think that, but it'll help make me better at that, help make all of us better at that, because it'll help us understand the people better, right? So when we're communicating with different people from different backgrounds, how do I communicate with each of these individuals in a way that's tuned to their personality, to their background, so I can have the biggest impact on them? That's where I can't do that as an individual, but with AI, I can start to approach that.
There's a couple of questions here, Andrew, hello, about copyright. We've talked about it a bit. So, and generative AI is copyright free. I suspect you've addressed it, but drawn from millions of human inputs, particularly concerned about images and source material, DALL-E and Midjourney, copyright. Is there anything else based on these specific questions you'd add clarifyingly?
Yeah, I'd say this is actually coming from the other side. So we talked a lot about the IP of the content that it produces, but this is about content that it's ingested so that it can create new stuff. Mm-hmm. There are a lot of questions around copyright. There are lawsuits that are underway. I think that's going to help resolve some of this. I think that OpenAI in particular has been pretty explicit, saying, hey, if you want to restrict your content so that we can't have access to it, we're willing to pay for it. And that's probably the way of the future, is that these models will have to start paying for content that previously was free because it was out there on the public internet. So it wasn't something that was protected. They could grab it. I think legally it's going to be very hard to accuse them they've broken any laws. Whether it was right or wrong is a different discussion, but I think they're going to have to pay for that content in the future.
Yeah, it's a little bit murkier than like Napster transitioning to Spotify, right? Where it's like completely stealing something as it was to, proper licensing, whether you like the model or not, it's what it is now, right? And but then you look at the opportunities that creates as well. And then the other related piece is, this is a murky area because it's something that's never happened before. So we as a society, and this is a global thing, not just an American thing, we got to figure this out. And we've got to have some standards for what is copyrightable. We also have to have some standards around licensing. And I do think people like OpenAI and a number of others are going to start paying for content. I think that's good. The other thing, though, to think about in this area that hasn't been talked about in this session is the idea of using the content you own to generate more content in your brand style and your brand voice, which is an opportunity here. So ChatGPT is really cool. It's trained on the internet, and the internet is both amazing and horrible. So when you go to ChatGPT, you get the benefit of the scale of the internet, but you also have really the content of the internet, as opposed to a more narrow model that might be trained on your content or content from a group of creative organizations pooling content together, and they agree to share that content and then generate new creative works from it or ideas for new creative works. There's a lot of opportunities around this where the technology can be used in lots of different ways that I think are quite powerful. So, think about Napster again. Out of Napster came a whole bunch of other ways of distributing content in real time that didn't exist before that technology. A lot of times, in that case, I think it was pretty obviously illegal, but a lot of times those kinds of innovations that might have been pretty bad in one way unleash a whole bunch of legitimate uses of technology. I think that's what's going to happen for the rest of this decade, is we're going to figure this stuff out.
Yeah, I'm seeing in chat some reactions to that from Andrew and others. There's a session you just did that talked about grant writing, Dray, and Doug is asking some questions about using AI to assist with grant writing and requesting study responses as backups to the grant. I wonder if you could, this is specific, but a lot of people write grants in this room.
So there were a lot of pieces to that. The core of our grant writing example was, again, providing enough context for it to be able to do something effective and useful. But there were a couple pieces when we talked about it that was around what kind of content are you comfortable providing to these models.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're providing study information, data information that maybe is not something you want the world having access to, you want to be aware of how that's going to be used.
Right.
ChatGPT in particular does have their data policies published. Before you give it anything sensitive, be very aware of what those data policies are and where you fall with your account. You do have options now on what's going to be shared, what's going to be stored, what's not going to be shared, what's going to be used in the model. All of that fun stuff has been added as they have been threatened around the world. But that is something to be aware of, that if you're using ChatGPT, if you're using Bing, Bard, you provide that information, they have it. So whatever their data policies are, they have that information. It was logged. You just need to make sure they've committed to using it in a way that you trust.
To be clear, you can make it private, though? You can use the tech and make it your data private?
You can. Again, you're trusting them to do so, but it's no different from trusting Microsoft Office 365 when you put your spreadsheets that are proprietary out there on their servers. So they absolutely will host it because they own it, or not own it, but they have it because you submitted it. But you trust their data policies that they're not going to share it. They're not going to feed it back into the model. You do have options to do that. You can basically say, don't use my data for training the model at your account level. You can also say, don't track anything and turn off the fact that it even records your conversations.
Okay, there's a long one here, and a field focused on artistic creative production. How can we know the sources of the underlying training data for the ML models don't scrape or use copyrighted materials? You can read the rest. Specifically, OpenAI has threatened to leave Europe if the EU enacts their new regulations. How should our sector balance this ethical issue?
All right, Amit's being quiet on this one first. I think it comes back to a lot of the techniques we've used. You aren't going to know the training data. They're going to publish, here's what we used, and they might give you large lists of sources. You're probably not going to dig through each of those to make sure there's no copyrighted material in those. Theoretically, if there was copyrighted material in those systems, those people could start suing, but you can't really rely on that. So the more you use your information, the better. So using your pictures, your images, your content, things that you have produced in the past, that gives you a reliable source that you know it was using that instead of something else out there in the world. That's the safest way to approach it.
Okay, there's just so many questions here. There's some specific tactical ones, like Douglas asked the question for the grant question. Can I take my data and put it in there and use it using my language? And or Lori says, how do I give it successful posts or other content in my voice? My example was to actually take and copy and put it into the prompt and say, use this, Jill's voice, Jill's words, and then leap from there. That is the right and good use of the tool. Yes.
Yes, I would add to that. There are a number of other tools we haven't had time to cover in this session that actually take into account things like brand voice and style. Like there's a product called Writer, there's another one called Jasper, which are specifically for this. And those products use actually the OpenAI LLM under the hood. They use GPT 3, 5, and 4, but they take into account your content and your style and brand guidelines you can put in. So those are paid products, but there's options if you want to go deeper. I always recommend people start with the free stuff and experiment with it and then move from there depending on what their needs are. But there's a lot of control over that, especially as you get into the more powerful tools. And remember, this stuff is changing rapidly. In the next few months, you're going to see Google and Microsoft introduce generative AI capabilities directly into Google Docs, directly into Microsoft Word and Microsoft 365. When that happens, you might not even need ChatGPT anymore. It might become kind of a background thing as opposed to something you're willing to go to a website for. I don't know the answer to that, obviously, but it's going to become kind of woven into everything we do, and you'll learn the best way to do what you just asked, which is how to make it sound like you and do what you want.
Yeah, and I just finally scrolled down to the point where I saw the question about the grants and the study responses. You're probably not going to be able to get ChatGPT to cite a study response. It's not going to tell you where it learned something. And if it does, it probably made it up. So don't trust that. That is definitely an area where, because you're asking for facts and a source, ChatGPT is probably not the tool yet. It's not a search engine yet. That said, they're starting to use plugins. So the ability that we had mentioned briefly before, the ability for it to reach out to other systems and get information that could be from browsers where it'll actually cite the link that it used. That can be your PDFs because you can plug it into PDF systems. It can plug into a lot of different systems to read a lot of information. And when it does that, it can cite it. I'd go back to what Amith said, though. You're probably looking for a more specific tool that you've said, here is my body of knowledge. Somewhat biased here because that's what we've been working on to address a lot of these questions, is having our own tool that does that. So Tassio makes a bot that is trained on your content. That allows us to circumvent a lot of these questions. We don't have to worry about it finding something that's incorrect. We can cite our information. ChatGPT is probably not going to do that for you.
Right. There's a variety of comments here and questions about that kind of tech, and it seems like those tools will grow. Tassio has one. There's a question about, I'm going to need to wrap us up, and I'll tell you, there's so many questions here that we might be able to get some of them answered and published alongside the recording of this and the deck. But would you both hire staffers with specific technical expertise to wrangle all of this, or would you say have everyone start using it, or a combination of both, or what?
My answer is yes.
Uh-huh.
It depends. I mean, like at a deeper level, the technical skill set to really understand this stuff is uncommon and very powerful, very useful. I would tell you that every person on this planet needs to understand how to use this stuff. So every employee across the company needs to have some basic knowledge of how these things work. And I'm a fan of leading by example and sharing the things that I do with this stuff, and also providing both some carrots and occasionally some sticks around that, saying, hey, listen, we're going to have a contest of people who come up with the coolest use of ChatGPT. We're going to have an award. And if we have 100% participation where every employee submits some idea, it doesn't matter if it's the same as others, we'll have a ice cream party at the end of the month or whatever. Like, just make it fun. And then, of course, you can turn around and also say, by the way, you have to do this. So, but I think it's really important that every employee has some general awareness of it. I don't think it's a skill set that, it's like this prompt engineering conversation for a while, maybe a month or two ago, maybe 3 months ago, there's like, oh, prompt engineering is the new discipline. It's going to become a university field. And I think it's totally ridiculous, because prompt engineering is an artifact of how incredibly immature these products are right now. They're going to be smart enough to figure out. In fact, you can go and ask ChatGPT to create a prompt for you to do what you want, right? And so like it's going to be solved. But my point is, There are specialized skills that are not the domain of the general workforce, but then for the most part, the things we're talking about here, everybody needs to learn this stuff.
Kimberly, I would just say, open up ChatGPT, create a free license, and start trying it. Just start testing and learning yourself. And as we transition here to the end of our session, a couple folks are asking something that I think, Dray, you talked about related to the grant writing, which is how are we going to know if ChatGPT is actually providing back something that is based on good experience, good data? And you said it right. So it's not going to cite the source. So it does require human beings to be able to make some decisions about whether what's been rendered back is expert. Yes.
Fact checking is still a requirement, for better or worse. And that means that for a lot of these tasks that people are trying to use it for, not a great idea. Again, with our home bot, the most common question I see is people come in and ask about themselves. That's how people test these things is, what do you know about me? And it doesn't. And it makes stuff up, and it knows absolutely nothing about me in particular, and it'll just answer anyway. So that's something that you need to be aware of, that facts, if it's something that is established for a very long period of time, probably going to get it right. If it's something that's either debated, there's disagreement, or if it's something that's fairly recent and still being figured out, I wouldn't trust it.
Okay, Jeremy, I see you. I don't know if you're still here. You've raised your hand because you're on the phone. I've just taken you off of mute. Can we hear you and your question? That may not work. So you made, oh, you are there.
He's still muted is what I was saying.
Yeah.
I'm on the spot.
Yeah, I'm not going to be able to do that technically perfectly, y'all. So, Jeremy, my apologies. We'll love to get your question in another way, maybe to me directly. But as we're transitioning here to the end of the webinar, I wanted to let you all know that among the other resources that we've put into the chat, Amith, you and some of your colleagues at Blue Cypress have just written a book. Can you just give us a couple words about that?
Sure. Ascend is a book all about the power of AI, and we target associations at Blue Cypress a lot, so member-based nonprofits. And so it's a lot of the content you've heard in much more depth, but very much approachable from a nonprofit leader's perspective. It's not about deep dive on technology. It's a practical, how do you go do this type of book. It's available now at Amazon at the QR code. If you zap that with your phone or use that link, you can grab it there. It's available for Kindle and also in print. And we'll also be updating it regularly on the Sidecar website. I mentioned that earlier and put it in the chat, but it's sidecarglobal.com. And if you sign up there, you'll get continuous updates to the book because this stuff is changing rapidly. So we, Dray and I put a lot of time and effort into the book, along with several of our other colleagues here, and we plan to continue that so that it'll be a living book and it'll continue to update. There'll be new editions probably every 6 to 9 months, every time AI doubles in power.
Yeah, terrific. Okay, and just before we leave you all, getting it back down to practical application, would love to see you put in chat one step you could commit to take this week that would have you using and testing and learning. I'll love to aggregate this and maybe get a sense and publish to the field how we are using it in arts and culture. So I'll let you do that as we are wrapping up here. Amith and Dray, really, thanks so much for joining this time with me. It has been a really big, eye-opening time for us as a sector to start testing and learning with this new technology. It's also a real pleasure to call you friends and to be part of the Blue Cypress family that expands at TRG's perspective beyond arts and culture into other nonprofits and other applications. I just am really glad and grateful for your generosity of time today. A final word from both of you would be terrific as we're wrapping up.
Well, first of all, thanks for having us. Really, it's been a lot of fun and learning more about the TRG arts world in this process. And I would say the number one thing is get out there and play with this stuff. Don't worry about the how and the what and all the details. Focus on learning it, and it'll pay a lot of dividends in both, I think, your professional life and also in your personal life.
Thank you very much, Jill. kind of repeat of that, just as a vendor in the AI space, I rely on you all to get involved. I need your feedback. I need people being responsible and ethical, challenging things, questioning things, and trying things. Because if you're not, I mean, I try, but I'm one person. I need more perspectives.
Okay, test and learn, test and learn, test and learn. Listen, everyone who's joined us today, I'm glad that this conversation and content was so meaningful. Perhaps more to come as we go. Thank you for your time today. Enjoy the rest of your weeks. Over and out for now. Thanks for being part of this deeper dive.